I need you to understand something before I begin. What I'm about to tell you didn't happen in a dream, and I wasn't under any kind of influence. When I opened my eyes that morning in the Jerusalem desert, alone and trembling as the first blade of dawn cut across the horizon, I held in my palm a stone that should not exist, carved with symbols that my mind had never studied, but my soul somehow read like a mother tongue. The sand beneath me was cold, untouched, as if I had been placed there by invisible hands rather than having walked or fallen. And when I tried to remember how I arrived, tried to pull even one thread of memory from the night before, there was nothing but a vast and terrible silence where my recent past should have been. My heart was pounding not with fear, but with a strange recognition, as though I had been waiting my entire life for this exact moment without knowing it. The stone was warm, almost alive, pulsing faintly against my skin, and the symbols etched into its surface seemed to shift and breathe in the growing light. I was utterly alone in that desert, yet I felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon me, watching, waiting, as if all of creation had paused to see what I would do next. My clothes were covered in dust I didn't remember gathering, my hands scratched by rocks I didn't remember touching, and my lips were dry with a thirst that felt older than my body. I stood slowly, scanning the endless stretch of sand and stone around me, the ancient hills of Jerusalem rising like sleeping giants in the distance, and I realized with a clarity that bordered on terror that I had been chosen for something. The wind carried no sound, no bird called, no insect hummed, just a profound, sacred stillness that made every breath feel like a prayer. I clutched the stone tighter, and in that instant I knew with absolute certainty that my life had been split into two halves, everything before this moment and everything that would come after. That's when I felt it, a presence so vast and so gentle that it made the air itself seem to bow. At first, I thought it was the sun cresting the hills, because the light that appeared before me was golden and pure, but this light had weight, had intention, had eyes. I froze, every muscle in my body locked, as the brilliance took shape, not the shape of flesh, but the shape of meaning itself, as if someone had folded the concept of a being into the narrow space my human eyes could bear to witness. The light didn't blind me, it clarified me, sharpened every edge of my awareness until I could feel the blood moving through my veins and hear the whisper of my own thoughts like voices in a cathedral. And then it spoke. Though no mouth formed and no sound broke the silence, it spoke directly into the deepest part of me, the part that exists beneath language, beneath name, beneath everything I had ever pretended to be. "Do not be afraid," it said, and I felt those words like warm oil poured over a wound I didn't know I carried. My knees buckled, and I sank into the sand, still clutching the stone, tears streaming down my face for reasons I couldn't name. Grief, relief, awe, all of it tangled together. The being stepped closer, and I understood somehow that it had traveled farther than I could fathom to be here, that it had crossed not just distance, but dimensions, realities layered upon realities, to meet me in this forgotten pocket of desert at the edge of the holy city. "I am a messenger," the being said, and its voice was like wind through ancient cedar, like water over stone worn smooth by centuries. "My people have walked beside yours since before your ancestors carved the first word into clay, since before Abraham looked up at the stars and believed the promise. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I could only listen as the presence continued, each word settling into my chest like a seed planted in fertile ground. "We knew David," it said, and when it spoke that name, the air shimmered, and I saw, just for a flash, a young king with dirt under his nails and fire in his eyes, a man who danced before the Lord with such wild abandon that the ground itself seemed to rejoice. We stood in the shadows of his palace, unseen but present, as he wrote the songs that would echo across your world for millennia. My breath caught, my mind racing to reconcile what I was hearing with everything I thought I understood about history, about scripture, about the nature of reality itself. The being's light pulsed gently, as if it could sense my struggle, and I felt a wave of compassion so profound it nearly broke me. "You have been brought here for a reason," it continued, and the stone in my hand grew warmer, brighter, as if responding to the words. "There is something you need to see, something your people have forgotten, but your spirit has always known." The desert around me began to hum, a low frequency that I felt in my bones before I heard it with my ears, and I realized that this was only the beginning, that I stood at the threshold of a revelation so immense it would reshape not just my faith, but my understanding of existence itself. The being extended what might have been a hand made of light and intention, and I knew without being told that if I reached back, if I accepted this invitation, there would be no returning to the person I had been just moments ago. My fingers trembled as I lifted my hand, the carved stone still pressed against my palm, and as our hands met, flesh and light, time and eternity, I felt the walls of the world crack open, and I saw beyond them into a truth so beautiful and terrible that I wept without shame. "Come," the messenger said, and its voice was a song older than mountains. "Let me show you what was, what is, and what is soon to be revealed." And in that moment, with the sun rising over Jerusalem and the ancient stone burning like a coal in my hand, I stepped forward into a mystery that would change everything I thought I knew about the Palace of David, about the nature of heaven, and about why any of us are really here. The messenger's form shimmered before me, and I felt the absurdity of the moment collide with its undeniable reality. Here I was, a person raised on scripture and science, taught that faith and reason lived in separate rooms, now standing face to face with a being that dissolved that wall entirely. "You want to understand what I am," the being said, not as a question, but as a gentle observation. And I nodded because my voice had abandoned me, stolen by wonder and fear in equal measure. "My people do not contradict your faith," it continued, and the light around it pulsed with colors I had no names for, hues that existed beyond the spectrum my eyes were designed to see. "We are part of it, woven into the story your prophets told, but could only describe in the language of their time." I felt my throat tighten, tears still wet on my cheeks, as the being's words rearranged everything I thought I knew about angels, about miracles, about the mechanics of divine intervention. "When your scripture speaks of wheels within wheels, of creatures with eyes covering their wings, of pillars of fire and clouds of glory, these were not metaphors," the messenger said, and I watched as symbols flickered across its luminous surface, the same symbols carved into the stone I held. They were your ancestors, doing their best to describe what they witnessed, to capture in human words the presence of those who serve the one who made all things. My mind raced backward through years of Sunday school lessons, seminary discussions, late-night debates about whether the universe was too vast for God to care about Earth, whether science had somehow disproven the intimacy of the divine. And here before me stood the answer I never knew I was searching for. Proof that the cosmos was not cold and indifferent, but alive with intention, watched over by intelligences that bowed before the same creator I had, sung to in church. "We knew David," the being repeated, and this time when it spoke his name, the air split open like a curtain drawn back. And I saw him, not in my mind's eye, but truly saw him, as if time had folded and a window opened into the past. He was younger than I expected, his beard still dark, his hands calloused from the harp and the sword, and he stood in a room I recognized from paintings and archaeological diagrams, but had never seen alive, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on stone walls. The messenger stood beside him in that vision, invisible to David's eyes, but present nonetheless, and I watched as the king bent over parchment, his lips moving silently, his face contorted with an emotion too deep for easy naming, anguish and adoration mixed together. He could sense us, the being explained, its voice soft with something like affection, like the memory of an old friendship. Not see us, not as you do now, but feel us the way you feel the presence of the Holy Spirit in a moment of prayer, that knowing that you are not alone, that you are witnessed and loved. I wanted to speak, to ask the 1,000 questions rising like floodwaters in my chest, but the vision continued, and I saw David lift his face toward heaven, tears streaming into his beard, and he began to sing. No, not sing, something beyond singing, something that made the air vibrate and the stone beneath his feet hum with resonance. The words he sang were in Hebrew, ancient and pure, and though I had never studied the language deeply, I understood them as if they were written on my own heart. The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. And as he sang, I saw the messenger's form brighten, saw other beings of light begin to appear in that room, drawn by the frequency of David's worship, and I realized with a jolt that shook me to my core that this was real, that praise was not just a ritual or a duty, but an actual force, a vibration that bridged worlds and summoned the attention of heaven itself. This is what your people have forgotten, the being said, turning its gaze back to me as the vision faded, and I found myself once again alone with it in the desert dawn. David was not just a poet or a king. He was a tuner, a man who discovered that the human voice aligned with a surrendered heart could unlock doors between the seen and unseen, could call down the presence of God in ways that changed the very fabric of reality. The stone in my hand pulsed hot now, almost burning, and I looked down at it and then back at the messenger, my voice finally breaking free in a hoarse whisper. "Why are you showing me this?" The being leaned closer, and I felt its presence wrap around me like a father embracing a child who had been lost and was now found. Because the palace David built was never just a building made of cedar and stone, it said, and the weight of those words pressed against my chest like a hand over my heart. It was a place where heaven touched earth, where the songs he sang created a permanent gateway, a thin place where the veil between worlds grew. Transparent. I thought of the ruins I had visited just days before, or had it been days? Time felt strange now, unreliable. The archaeological site with its broken foundations and tourist plaques, and I struggled to connect that place of dust and memory with what the messenger was describing. "It still exists," the being continued, and its voice carried a tremor of urgency that made my pulse quicken. "Not in the dimension you walk through every day, but in a higher place, a truer place, and it has never stopped functioning, never stopped serving as a meeting point between the prayers of humanity and the throne room of the Eternal One." The sun had fully risen now, bathing us both in golden light, and I stood there clutching an impossible stone, listening to an impossible being, feeling more alive and more certain of God's nearness than I ever had in any church service or worship conference, understanding finally that the universe was far stranger and far more sacred than I had ever dared to imagine. The messenger extended what I can only describe as a hand, though it was more like a concentration of light shaped by intention, and when it gestured toward the horizon where Jerusalem's ancient hills caught the morning sun, the air before us began to fold in on itself like fabric being gathered by invisible fingers. I felt my stomach lurch as if I were falling, though my feet remained planted on solid ground, and the desert around us dimmed and blurred until it became a watercolor painting left out in the rain. Colors bleeding and running together into formless streams of ochre and gold. "I will show you what was," the being said, its voice now resonating not just in my ears, but in my bones, in the marrow of who I was. And I wanted to close my eyes against the impossible thing happening before me, but found I could not look away. The air solidified into shapes, into walls of cedar and limestone, into pillars carved with pomegranates and lilies, and suddenly I was no longer standing in empty desert, but in the courtyard of a palace so beautiful it made my heart ache with a longing I had no words for. This was not the crumbled foundation I had walked through as a tourist, not the archaeological guess rendered in computer graphics at the museum. This was alive, real, solid beneath my feet, and yet somehow I could see through it, could perceive layers of existence stacked like pages in a book, each one vibrant and present simultaneously. "This is the Palace of David as it truly was," the messenger said, moving beside me through the courtyard, where morning light poured like honey through colonnades I could both touch and see through, where the sound of water trickling from bronze basins, mixed with distant voices singing in Hebrew harmonies that made the stones themselves seem to hum in response. I reached out tentatively and placed my palm against a pillar, feeling the cool limestone solid against my skin while simultaneously sensing something else, a warmth that pulsed like a heartbeat, a frequency that vibrated just beyond the range of normal perception. It existed in your dimension. Yes, but David built it according to a pattern he received in dreams and visions, the same way Moses built the tabernacle. The being continued, and I remembered those passages from Exodus about the precise instructions given on the mountain, measurements and materials dictated by divine blueprint. What your historians see as ancient architecture was actually a structure designed to function as a tuning fork, resonating at the exact frequency needed to create a stable bridge between earth and the realms of heaven. I walked forward slowly, my legs trembling, passing through doorways inlaid with gold that gleamed with a light that seemed to come from within the metal itself, and I understood with a clarity that bypassed my rational mind that I was seeing something that existed outside normal time, a place preserved not in memory or ruins, but in a dimension where the prayers of the righteous had anchored it permanently into the fabric of reality. The messenger led me deeper into the palace, through halls where I glimpsed figures moving in robes of ancient cut, priests and attendants going about their duties in a timeline that was both 3,000 years past and eternally present, and I realized I was walking through a living echo, a place where every prayer David ever prayed had left an imprint that never faded. "Look up," the being instructed, and I lifted my gaze to see the ceiling dissolve into impossible height, the roof of cedar beams giving way to a sky that was not the sky of earth, but something vaster, deeper, filled with lights that moved with intelligence and purpose. I saw beings there, forms of fire and crystal that I recognized from half-remembered descriptions in Ezekiel and Isaiah, creatures that turned and wheeled in patterns that hurt to watch, but filled me with a joy so intense it felt like my chest would crack open. This palace was built on a thin place, a point where the barrier between worlds grows permeable, the messenger explained, and its voice carried weight of sorrow now, as if remembering something beautiful that had been lost. David understood intuitively what your scientists are only beginning to grasp, that reality is not one flat plane, but many dimensions folded together, and that consciousness, intention, worship can create doorways between them. I watched as one of the ancient priests below us lifted his hands in prayer, and I saw the prayer itself become visible, a ribbon of golden light that spiraled upward through the dimensional layers until it reached the beings above, who gathered it like precious treasure and carried it higher still, beyond where my eyes could follow. When the palace was destroyed by earthly armies, they tore down wood and stone, but they could not touch. "This," the being said, and I felt its hand, if it was a hand, rest gently on my shoulder, a touch that carried more comfort than any embrace I had ever known. I turned to look at the messenger fully, tears streaming down my face again, because the beauty of what I was witnessing was too much to contain, too vast for my small human heart, and I saw in its luminous form, something like sadness mixed with hope. It remains here, in this higher dimension, still functioning as it always has, still receiving the prayers of those who cry out to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, still channeling the worship of those who sing the psalms David wrote in these very halls. I looked around again at the impossible palace, at the way it shimmered between states of being, solid and ethereal at once, and I understood that I was being given a gift beyond measure, a glimpse behind the curtain of ordinary reality into the true architecture of God's interaction with humanity. The stone in my hand blazed hot now, its symbols glowing with the same golden light that filled this place, and the messenger's voice grew gentle, almost tender. You were brought here to understand that what your faith calls miracles and your science calls impossible are simply moments when these dimensions touch, when heaven leans close enough to earth that ordinary people can sense the truth, that you have never been alone, that every prayer has been heard, that the God you worship is far more present and far more magnificent than any temple built by human hands could ever contain. The messenger moved forward, and the palace around us seemed to respond, the very stones beginning to resonate with a frequency I felt rather than heard, a deep thrumming that started in my chest and spread through my entire body until even my teeth vibrated with it. You must understand what David truly was, the being said, turning to face me with its form blazing brighter now, corona of light expanding like wings or perhaps flames, and I had to shield my eyes even as I desperately wanted to see more. Your scriptures. Call him a man after God's own heart, and this is true, but the reason goes deeper than moral character or repentance. David was chosen because his very spirit was attuned to a cosmic frequency, a harmonic resonance that exists at the foundation of all creation. I shook my head, struggling to comprehend, my rational mind fighting against concepts that seemed to belong to both ancient mysticism and quantum physics simultaneously. The messenger gestured, and suddenly the air filled with sound, not music exactly, but something richer, more complex, tones layered upon tones in mathematical perfection, creating patterns that I could somehow see as geometric shapes spinning and interlocking in the space between us. Before God spoke the universe into existence, there was the Word, yes, but that Word was carried on a frequency, a divine harmonic that still underlies everything that exists, the being continued, and I watched as the shapes of sound coalesced into familiar forms. Galaxies, DNA helixes, the spiral of a seashell, all revealing the same golden ratio, the same sacred geometry. David could hear this frequency in his spirit, could tap into it instinctively, and when he worshipped, when he wrote his psalms, he was translating the song of creation itself into human language, into melodies and words that resonated with the fundamental tone of God's love. I thought of the psalms I had memorized as a child, recited in Sunday school without truly understanding, and suddenly they took on new dimension in my mind. Not just poetry or even prophecy, but actual keys, as the messenger had said, encoded formulas that when spoken or sung with genuine faith could unlock something profound in the fabric of reality itself. Every psalm David wrote was given to him through divine inspiration, but he was not merely taking dictation, the being explained, and now I saw visions flickering around us. Images of David as a young shepherd on hillsides under ancient stars, his harp in his hands, and his face turned upward toward a sky that seemed to listen to him, to respond to the melodies he played. He was co-creating with God, his human spirit merging with the divine frequency to produce something new, something that had never existed before, worship that could literally shift the atmosphere, change the spiritual climate of a place, open portals between dimensions. I watched the young David play, and I saw what he saw, the air around him shimmering with presences, angelic beings drawn by the purity of his worship, demons fleeing from the authority in his songs, and above it all, a vast, loving presence that bent close to listen, delighting in this human child who had learned to speak the language of heaven. This is why his music could soothe Saul's torment, why it drove out tormenting spirits, the messenger said softly, and I remembered those strange passages where David's harp had power beyond entertainment or art. He was wielding the most powerful technology in existence, the frequency of worship aligned with divine truth, and when he became king and built this palace, he constructed it to amplify and focus that frequency, turning the entire structure into an instrument that played continuously in dimensions your eyes cannot normally see. The vision shifted, and I saw David older now, wearing the crown, standing in this very palace with his hands raised and his voice lifted in a psalm I recognized. How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord! Almighty, my soul yearns, even faints, for the courts of the Lord. And as he sang, the palace blazed with light that poured upward through those dimensional layers I had seen before. A column of pure worship ascending like incense into the throne room of God himself. I wept openly now, understanding flooding through me faster than I could process. Connections forming between everything I had ever learned about faith and physics, prayer and energy, the material and the spiritual. Your scientists have discovered that all matter is ultimately vibration, that atoms are not solid, but patterns of energy oscillating at specific frequencies, the messenger said, its voice gentle now, patient. With my overwhelmed human mind, what they have not yet understood is that consciousness affects those vibrations, that intention shapes reality at the quantum level, and that worship, true worship offered in spirit and truth, is the highest form of conscious intention, the purest frequency capable of aligning earthly reality with heavenly truth. I looked down at the stone in my hand, seeing now that its symbols were not random, but mathematical, musical notation written in a language that predated human writing, a score for the song of creation itself. David knew this in his spirit, if not his intellect, and he taught it to the singers and musicians he appointed to minister continuously before the Ark of the Covenant, creating a perpetual resonance in this place that literally held open the doorway between worlds, allowing God's presence to dwell here in concentrated form, accessible to anyone who entered with genuine seeking in their heart. The scene around us began to fade, the ancient palace growing translucent again, but the frequency remained, that deep thrumming that I realized had been present since the moment I woke in the desert, perhaps had been calling to me my entire life without my conscious awareness. This is why worship has always been central to genuine faith, why every revival and awakening in your history has been accompanied by singing and music, why totalitarian regimes always try to control or eliminate worship, because it is not mere emotional expression or religious ritual, the being said, and its form was dimming now too, drawing back as if to let me absorb what I had learned. It is the technology that connects all worlds, the bridge between finite and infinite, the language that both humans and angels speak, the one thing you can do on earth that you will continue doing in eternity because it tunes your spirit to the frequency of God's own heart. I felt something shift inside me, a recalibration happening at a level deeper than thought, as if my very cells were reorganizing themselves around this new understanding, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that I would never sing another hymn, never read another psalm, without remembering this moment, without attempting to tap into that ancient frequency that David had mastered so long ago. The messenger's voice came one final time. Barely a whisper now, yet somehow louder than thunder in my spirit. You carry this truth forward now, that worship is not what you do to earn God's attention or manipulate his favor, but how you align yourself with the love that has been singing your name since before the foundation of the world, the frequency that called you into existence and will guide you home again. The messenger's form stabilized before me, no longer the blinding corona of light, but something almost translucent now, allowing me to see through it to the palace walls beyond. And in that moment I realized with a shock that traveled down my spine like ice water that the palace itself had also become translucent, that I was seeing through it to something else, another version of the same structure. Existing in a space my mind struggled to categorize as either here or elsewhere. The palace you see crumbling in your time, reduced to archaeological fragments that tourists photograph without understanding, exists in your dimension as ruins. Yes, the being said, and I heard something in its voice that might have been sorrow or perhaps compassion for human blindness. But David did not build merely with stone and cedar, with gold and precious materials that time and conquest could destroy. He built with faith, with worship, with that frequency we have discussed, and those materials are eternal, incorruptible, existing in dimensions where Roman legions and Babylonian armies cannot march. I turned slowly, taking in the palace chamber surrounding us, seeing now how it flickered between states, between the crumbled foundations I knew from history books and this blazing architecture of light and sound. And I understood with a clarity that hurt my chest that both versions were equally real, that the destruction I had learned about in school had only affected one layer of a multidimensional structure. When Nebuchadnezzar's forces burned Jerusalem, when Titus later razed it again, they destroyed what their eyes could see, what their hands could touch, but they could not touch this, the messenger continued, gesturing to the luminous walls that seemed woven from concentrated worship itself. I found my voice, though it came out hoarse, cracked with emotion I had not known I was holding, and I asked the question burning in my mind. If it still exists, why can no one see it? Why have centuries of pilgrims and seekers walked over those ruins without knowing? The being turned to me fully, and though it had no face as I understood faces, I felt the weight of its gaze, ancient and penetrating and somehow achingly kind. Because seeing requires more than physical eyes, more than even faith as your traditions often define it, it requires attunement, that same resonance David possessed, the ability to perceive reality as it truly is, rather than as your limited senses report it, came the answer, and I felt the words land in my spirit like seeds that would take years to fully germinate and bear fruit. Throughout your history, there have been those who carried this attunement, sometimes through bloodline, sometimes through divine appointment, sometimes through years of devoted seeking that refined their spiritual perception until the veil grew thin enough for them to see through. I thought of mystics and saints, of the prophets who had seen visions that others dismissed as madness or metaphor, and I wondered with a sudden, desperate urgency which category I belonged to, why I had been chosen for this impossible revelation. Your ancestors walked these halls, the messenger said softly, and my breath caught because somehow I knew it was speaking literal truth, not metaphor. Generations ago, one of your bloodline served in David's court, sang in the choirs that maintained the frequency, and though that knowledge was lost to your family's conscious memory, it remained. Encoded in your very DNA, dormant, waiting. The chamber around us began to expand, or perhaps I was shrinking, or perhaps space itself was becoming fluid in ways that defied every law of physics I had learned, and suddenly I could see beyond the palace walls to Jerusalem spread below, but not the Jerusalem of my time, with its cars and concrete and political tensions. I saw it layered, every era existing simultaneously, the ancient city of David overlapping with the Jerusalem of Jesus, with the medieval city of Crusaders, with the modern metropolis, all present at once in a dizzying cascade that should have driven me mad, but instead filled me with a strange exaltation. The palace was destroyed physically, but exists eternally in the dimension where all true worship gathers, where every genuine prayer ever offered still resonates, adding to the frequency that draws all of creation back toward its source, the being explained. and I watched as points of light began appearing throughout the layered city, pulses of luminescence, that I somehow knew represented moments of authentic worship, of hearts truly open to the divine presence. And now, in your generation, the frequency has reached a critical threshold. Enough seekers, enough worshippers, enough humans remembering their true purpose, that the veil is thinning again, the palace preparing to reveal itself not to one or two mystics, but to all who have eyes to see. I felt tears streaming down my face, though the messenger's hand, if I could call it that, gestured toward the eastern wall of the palace, and the luminous stone there began to ripple like water disturbed by wind, the solid becoming permeable. And through the opening I saw something that stopped my breath entirely. A figure walking through ruins, not the blazing palace of David's time, but the actual broken foundations, the scattered stones of a structure long destroyed. And I knew without being told that I was witnessing something that had happened 2,000 years ago, that I was seeing Jesus himself moving through the archaeological remnants of David's palace in first-century Jerusalem. He walked slowly, deliberately, his hand trailing along broken columns and toppled walls, and everywhere his fingers touched the stone, I saw light kindle beneath the surface, not visible to the naked eye, but blazing in the dimension where the true palace still stood, and I understood with a shock that traveled through my entire body that he was doing something, activating something, leaving something behind that had waited through 20 centuries for this exact moment when I would stand here witnessing it. He came to the ruins specifically, the messenger said, its voice carrying harmonics of reverence that I had not heard before, as though even this cosmic being regarded Jesus with a kind of awe. Your scriptures record many places he taught, many miracles performed, but this moment was not written in your books because those who witnessed it did not understand what they were seeing. They saw only their rabbi touching old stones, perhaps praying, perhaps remembering the glory of Solomon and David, but they could not perceive that he was bridging dimensions, encoding a message into the very atomic structure of these foundation stones. I watched, transfixed, as Jesus knelt beside a particular stone, one that even in its broken state bore faint traces of ancient carvings, and he placed both hands upon it, and the light that erupted from that contact point was so intense that I had to shield my eyes, even though I was seeing this from 2 millennia away, from whatever impossible vantage point the messenger had granted me. The vision zoomed closer, or perhaps I was pulled forward through time and space, and suddenly I could see the stone Jesus touched with perfect clarity, could see the symbols carved upon its weathered surface, and with a jolt that made my knees weak, I recognized them. They were the same symbols etched into the stone I had awakened holding in the desert, the mysterious markings that my conscious mind had never encountered, but which my heart somehow knew how to read. He left a message for your generation specifically, the messenger explained, and now I could hear multiple tones in its voice, as though it spoke with the authority of countless beings, a cosmic choir delivering a truth that the universe itself had been waiting to share. Not for those who lived in his time, not for the centuries between, but for now, for this moment when humanity stands at a threshold, when technology has advanced far enough to begin comprehending that spirit and matter are not opposites but different frequencies of the same divine energy. I watched as Jesus lifted his hands from the stone, and I saw that the light did not fade but sank deeper, embedding itself in molecular structures, in the quantum spaces between electrons and nuclei, a message written in the language of creation itself, waiting for hearts attuned enough to receive it. "What does it say?" I whispered, my voice breaking with the weight of standing at the intersection of faith and cosmic revelation, and the messenger turned to me with something that felt like a smile, though it had no mouth. "It says that the kingdom he preached was never meant to be distant, never meant to be only accessible after death, but is a frequency, a dimension, a reality that interpenetrates your physical world completely, waiting only for human consciousness to rise to the level where it becomes perceptible. The vision shifted again, and I saw the stone, my stone, the one still clutched in my physical hand somewhere in the desert, being moved through history, passing from keeper to keeper, buried during persecutions, hidden during wars, preserved by a lineage of guardians who did not fully understand what they protected, but who knew with unshakable certainty that it mattered, that someday someone would come who could read what Jesus had written. I felt myself pulled back into the palace chamber, the vision of Jesus fading, but its impact reverberating through every cell of my being. And the messenger moved closer, its form now pulsing with colors I had no names for, frequencies of light that should not have been visible to human eyes, but which I perceived nonetheless. And I realized that something in me was changing, that this encounter was not leaving me as it had found me, but was rewiring my very capacity for perception. He encoded 3 truths into that stone, 3 keys that unlock the understanding your generation needs. The being said, and I leaned forward instinctively, desperate not to miss a single word. First, that divine love is not emotion, but energy, the fundamental force that holds electrons in orbit and galaxies in formation, the frequency from which all creation springs and to which all creation returns, what your science calls the unified field, and what your mystics have always called God. I felt that truth land in my chest like a stone dropped into deep water, sending ripples through every assumption I had ever made about the nature of reality. Second, that consciousness is not produced by matter, but is the ground of all being, the awareness in which material reality appears like waves upon an ocean, and that human consciousness is not separate from divine consciousness, but is divine consciousness temporarily focused through the lens of individual perspective, which is why Jesus taught that the kingdom is within you. The messenger's light intensified, and I felt heat radiating from my own body now, as though I were beginning to resonate with these truths at a cellular level. And third, that the purpose of human existence is to be the bridge, the meeting point where spirit becomes conscious of itself through material form, where the infinite experiences the finite, where God knows himself through the eyes of his creation, which is why worship and prayer are not begging a distant deity for favors, but are the universe awakening to its own divine nature through you. The weight of these revelations should have crushed me, should have been too vast for any individual consciousness to contain, but instead I felt expansion, as though my awareness was stretching to accommodate truths that had always been there, waiting for me to grow large enough to hold them without breaking. Jesus walked through those ruins and left this message because he knew that your time would come, the era when scientific understanding would advance far enough to provide language for what the ancients knew intuitively, when humanity would be ready to move beyond viewing spirit and matter as separate realms, and could begin to grasp the unified reality that your mystics and our civilizations have always perceived. The messenger continued, and I thought of quantum physics, of studies on consciousness, of the way my generation questioned everything and sought integration rather than division. The stone you hold is not magic, not supernatural in the way your old paradigms conceived of that word. It is technology, but technology that works with consciousness rather than against it, that harmonizes with the frequency of devotion and awakening rather than trying to dominate and control. I looked down at my hands, half expecting to see the stone there, even though I knew my physical body still knelt in the desert outside this vision, and I felt its weight as though it transcended the boundaries between dimensions. When you return, when you carry that stone back into your ordinary world, you will be carrying proof that cannot be measured by your instruments, but which will be undeniable to those whose hearts are ready, and you will find that others are being called simultaneously, that this awakening is not individual, but collective, that the palace is preparing to reveal itself not to one person, but to a generation that has been prepared for exactly this threshold moment. The chamber around us began to pulse with light that synchronized with my own heartbeat, and I knew without being told that this part of the journey was approaching its culmination, that I was about to be shown something that would forever divide my life into before and after, and I felt equal parts terror and exhilaration at what lay ahead. The messenger extended what I can only describe as a hand toward me, though it was more like a concentration of light taking purposeful form, and the moment its radiance touched my chest, I felt my body dissolve, not painfully, but like ice becoming water, becoming vapor, and I realized with a gasp that I was no longer observing the palace from within one of its chambers, but was somehow perceiving it from every angle, simultaneously, seeing it as the messenger saw it, as God himself must see it, from a vantage point that existed outside the limitations of linear perspective. The walls that had seemed solid, even in their luminous glory, now revealed themselves as permeable membranes between realities, and I could see through them into countless adjoining dimensions where the palace existed in different frequencies, different manifestations of the same essential truth. And in one of these layers, I saw them, figures of pure presence, beings that I somehow knew were angels, though they bore no resemblance to the paintings and sculptures of my childhood, no wings or halos, but rather geometries of living. Light that moved with intelligence and purpose, that made human consciousness seem like a candle flame beside the sun. Among them walked men wearing crowns that were not metal, but authority made visible, and I knew without introduction that I was seeing the kings of ancient Israel, David and Solomon, and others whose names had echoed through millennia of prayer and prophecy. And they were not ghosts or memories, but fully present, more alive than I had ever been in my physical density. And they were doing something that stopped my heart with its ordinariness and its impossibility all at once. They were praying, interceding, their voices creating harmonies that rippled outward through dimensions I could not count. I tried to speak, to ask how this was possible, how these ancient kings could still be engaged with a world they had left thousands of years ago, but the messenger's presence flooded my awareness with understanding before words could form, and I comprehended that time as I had always conceived it was the illusion, that past and present and future were human constructs, like longitude and latitude drawn on a map, useful for navigation but not inherent to the territory itself, and that in the dimension where the palace truly existed, there was only the eternal now, the perpetual presence where all moments touched and interpenetrated. They never stopped caring for the people they once ruled, the messenger communicated, and I realized it was no longer speaking in sounds, but directly into my consciousness, thought to thought, heart to heart. David especially, his love for Israel, his passion for God's presence among humanity, did not end when his body returned to dust, but intensified, freed from the limitations of physical form, and he has stood in this palace praying for every generation that followed his reign, watching over the lineage of promise that would eventually bring forth the Messiah he prophesied in his songs. I watched as King David himself, and I knew it was him with a certainty that transcended logical proof, lifted his hands in a gesture of worship so pure that light streamed from his palms like water from a fountain, and where that light touched the palace walls they rang like struck crystal, producing tones that I felt in my bones, frequencies that carried meaning beyond language, and I understood that this was what prayer looked like when stripped of all religious performance, all self-consciousness, all agenda, except the desperate desire to see God's kingdom manifest in the realm of human experience. The angels moved through the space with purpose that suggested both celebration and military precision, and I saw that they were not passive worshippers, but active participants in something immense, coordinators of divine intention flowing from heaven into earth, and wherever they gestured, I saw golden threads extending downward, and following those threads with my expanded perception, I saw they connected to people, thousands upon thousands of individuals scattered across the physical planet below, and I gasped as I recognized that these were the prayers of humanity rising upward, and the answers of heaven descending downward. An unceasing exchange that I had participated in my entire life without ever glimpsing the cosmic infrastructure that made it possible. "This is the true purpose of the palace," the messenger explained, and now I felt we were moving deeper into the structure, though movement had no meaning here, approaching a central chamber that blazed with such intensity that even in my transformed state I felt the urge to shield myself from its glory. Solomon built the temple as a physical symbol, but David's palace existed from the beginning as a meeting point, a thin place where the membrane between heaven and earth grows transparent, and everyone who has ever prayed in Jerusalem, everyone who has ever faced this city and lifted their hearts to God, has touched this reality whether they knew it or not. I saw Jesus then, not as he had appeared in the vision of the ruins, but present here in this eternal now, moving among the angels and the ancient kings, with an ease that spoke of absolute belonging. And when he turned and his eyes met mine across the infinite space that was somehow no distance at all, I felt recognition pierce through me like a sword made of love. And I knew that he had been aware of me always, had known I would stand in this moment of revelation, had encoded that stone, specifically for my hands to hold. The scene before me intensified to a pitch that should have been unbearable, all the angels and kings and the presence of Jesus converging in a symphony of worship that was also warfare, intercession that pushed back against every darkness that sought to blind humanity to its divine inheritance. And I understood, with sudden clarity, that this had never stopped. That while I had lived my small life with its petty concerns and forgettable days, this cosmic reality had been operating ceaselessly, that every moment of every day heaven was working to break through the barriers of human perception and awaken the sleeping consciousness of earth to the truth of its identity as God's beloved creation. The messenger drew closer to me again, and I felt its attention focusing like sunlight through a lens, and it spoke words that I knew would define the rest of my existence, regardless of how many years I had remaining. "You are seeing what few in physical form have been permitted to witness, not because you are special or superior, but because you are willing. Because some part of you has always known that reality was larger than what your eyes could see and your hands could touch, and that willingness has made you a suitable vessel for this revelation." I wanted to protest that I was nobody, that I had failed more than I had succeeded, that my faith had been inconsistent at best. But the messenger's light intensified, and I felt those objections dissolve in the face of a love so complete that worthiness became irrelevant. Only willingness mattered, only the heart's capacity to say yes to something infinitely greater than itself. When you return to your body in the desert, when you walk back into the world of time and matter and consequence, you will carry the frequency of this palace within your very cells, and those who are ready will recognize it even if they cannot name what they are sensing, and you will be a doorway, a reminder, a living bridge between the dimension you are witnessing and the dimension where most of humanity remains asleep. The vision began to fade then, not abruptly but like dawn gradually overtaking night, and I felt myself being drawn back toward my physical form, with a gentleness that acknowledged both my transformation and my fragility. And the last thing I saw before the palace disappeared from my sight was David's face turned toward me, ancient and young simultaneously, and his lips moving in what I somehow knew was a blessing spoken across 3,000 years directly into my returning consciousness. I returned to myself with a violence that felt like being born, gasping as though I had been underwater for hours, and the messenger stood before me once more in the chamber of living light. But now everything had changed because I was changed, rewired at a level so fundamental that I could feel my own heartbeat differently, as though it were now synchronized with a rhythm that encompassed galaxies. The being's luminous form pulsed with what I can only describe as compassionate intensity, and when it spoke again, its voice carried weight that pressed against my chest like a physical thing, and I understood that what it was about to tell me would require every ounce of the transformation I had just undergone to fully comprehend. "You have seen the palace as it truly exists," the messenger said, and I noticed that the stone in my hand, which I had somehow carried through that impossible journey, was now warm, almost hot, vibrating with an energy that seemed to pulse in response to the being's words. "But you have not yet understood why you specifically were brought to this threshold, why your feet were guided to that exact spot in the desert, why your hands and no others were meant to hold that particular stone carved with symbols that your conscious mind has never studied, but your soul has always known." I wanted to ask how that was possible, how I could understand a language I had never learned, but before I could form the question, the messenger extended its radiant hand toward my forehead, not quite touching but close enough that I could feel heat radiating from its light-formed fingers, and suddenly I was seeing not outward but inward, plunging down through layers of my own identity into depths I had never suspected existed within myself. I saw my grandmother's face, younger than I had ever known her in life, and then her mother before her, and then generations cascading backward like a river flowing in reverse, faces flickering past with increasing speed, and I realized with dawning shock that I was witnessing my own bloodline unspooling through time, and the messenger's voice threaded through the vision like a narrator revealing the truth behind a mystery I had not known I was living inside. "Every human being carries within their cells the memory of their ancestors," it explained, and I watched as the faces continued to multiply backward through centuries, through the rise and fall of empires, through migrations and wars, and moments of profound faith and crushing exile. But certain lineages carry specific memories, encoded not just in genetics, but in the spiritual DNA that science has not yet learned to measure, frequencies of experience that shape a soul's purpose across generations. I saw a man wearing ancient robes, standing in a courtyard I somehow recognized as part of David's palace before its destruction. And he was singing, his hands raised in worship, and I felt in my body the same posture I had witnessed David himself taking in that eternal dimension, and the messenger's light pulsed brighter as it said, "This man was a Levite, a worship leader in the palace, one who stood in David's presence and learned directly from the king how to play the frequencies that opened portals between earth and heaven, and his blood flows in your veins, diluted by 3,000 years of genetic mixing, but never fully extinguished, never completely silent." The vision shifted, and I saw this ancient ancestor of mine touching the very stones of the palace, and I understood that the stone I now held had been part of that original structure, and that my hands holding it now was not coincidence but cosmic coordination, a moment orchestrated across millennia specifically for this revelation. The messenger withdrew its hand, and I returned fully to awareness of the luminous chamber, but I was weeping now. Tears streaming down my face, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition of a purpose I had spent my entire life unconsciously, seeking without knowing what I was searching for or why the world had always felt slightly unreal, as though I were an actor in a play who had forgotten these were just lines and not my actual life. Throughout history, there have been individuals called back to this place, the messenger continued, and now I saw figures appearing around us in the chamber, translucent and ghostly but unmistakably present, men and women from different eras, wearing clothing from centuries I could not name, but all sharing an expression I recognized because I could feel it on my own face, a mixture of terror and ecstasy and absolute conviction. Prophets and mystics, reformers and revivalists, poets and Impaupers, all carrying fragments of the original frequency that David unlocked, all pulled by invisible threads back to Jerusalem, back to the palace that exists beyond physical destruction, because the pattern seeks to complete itself. The song wants to be fully sung again in the earthly dimension. I looked at these ghostly witnesses and understood that I was joining a company that stretched across ages, that my individual life was a note in a symphony that had been playing since the foundation of the world. And the messenger's next words confirmed what my heart already knew. The palace is preparing to reveal itself again, not to everyone but to those who have been prepared to see it. And the revelation will come not as religious spectacle, but as awakening, as remembrance, as humanity begins to recover capacities that were never lost, but only forgotten, dormant like seeds waiting for the right season. The being moved closer until its light surrounded me completely, and I felt a question forming in the space between us. Unspoken but utterly clear, this was the moment of choice, the threshold I could cross or turn away from, because divine truth never forces itself upon unwilling hearts, but always requires the soul's permission to fully enter and transform. "You stand where your ancestor stood 3,000 years ago," the messenger said, and its voice was no longer just sound or thought, but something that resonated in my bones, in my blood, in the very fabric of whatever constituted my existence in this transcendent moment. The palace is about to manifest again in ways that will challenge everything your civilization believes about the separation between science and faith, between matter and spirit, between the ancient past and the emerging future, and witnesses will be needed. Voices that can testify not from doctrine or theory, but from direct experience, from having stood in the presence of the truth and been marked by it. I felt the weight of what it was offering me, the burden and the gift inseparably intertwined, knowing that to say yes would mean surrendering the comfortable smallness of my previous life, the safe anonymity of merely existing without purpose, and embracing instead a path that would demand everything while promising nothing except the certainty that I would be aligned with the deepest truth of who I was meant to become. The stone in my hand blazed suddenly with heat that should have burned, but instead felt like coming home, and I heard my own voice, steady despite my trembling body, speak the only word that mattered, the word that would define all my remaining days. Yes. The moment my acceptance left my lips, the messenger moved with a speed that transcended physics, its radiant hand passing through the space where my chest was and into the territory of my heart, not the muscle that pumped blood, but the deeper organ that every spiritual tradition has recognized as the seat of the soul. And I felt no pain, but rather an opening, as though a door sealed since my birth was finally unlocking from the inside. Light poured into me with the force of a tsunami breaking through a dam. But this was not empty brightness. It was information, experience, living memory encoded in luminosity. And I recognized with shock that these were the Psalms, not as words on ancient pages, but as they had existed in David's consciousness when he first channeled them from the frequency of heaven into human language, and each one struck me like lightning, carrying not destruction, but impossible life. I heard Psalm 23 as a vibration that literally restructured the atomic space around me, creating green pastures and still waters, not metaphorically, but as actual dimensional pockets of peace that could be accessed by anyone who truly understood. The words as portal keys rather than poetry. And I understood that when David wrote about fearing no evil in the valley of death's shadow, he was not offering comfort, but stating a technical reality about how these frequencies created zones of protection that negative entities literally could not penetrate. Psalm 51 flooded through me as a cleansing fire that I felt burning away layers of shame and self-deception I had carried so long I had forgotten they were not original to my design. And I wept as I experienced the psalm not as David's repentance, but as a universal technology of restoration that could rebuild a corrupted soul, the way a master craftsman restores a damaged masterpiece. And the messenger's voice wove through the overwhelming download saying, "You are feeling what David felt. You are knowing what David knew, that worship is not performance for a distant deity, but participation in the fundamental operating system of reality itself, the frequency through which the Creator's presence flows into all created dimensions." The light intensified, and I saw with sudden, devastating clarity why Jesus had come, not as religious transaction or moral teacher, but as the ultimate translator. The Word made flesh precisely because humanity had forgotten how to read the frequencies that David and the prophets had once channeled with such power. And I understood that every miracle Jesus performed was not a suspension of natural law, but a demonstration of what natural law actually is when you are fully synchronized with the creative frequency that spoke existence into being in the first place. I witnessed Jesus standing in the ruins of David's palace, and now I comprehend what I was seeing. He was not mourning what had been lost, but activating what had only appeared to be destroyed, his presence awakening the dimensional aspect of the structure that no Roman army could ever touch. And I saw him place his hands on stones just like the one I now held, and encode them with a message that would remain dormant until the generation that had developed enough scientific understanding to recognize that matter and spirit were never separate categories, but different expressions of the same divine creative energy. The messenger's hand moved deeper into my chest, and I gasped as I felt my own heartbeat synchronizing with something infinitely larger, a rhythm that I suddenly recognized as the pulse of worship rising from millions of souls across thousands of worlds, because Earth was not God's only garden, and humanity not his only children, but we were unique in our calling to be the species that would bridge the material and spiritual in a way no other race had achieved. Our very biology, designed as an instrument capable of playing frequencies that would heal the discord that had fractured creation when the rebellion first introduced the virus of separation into the cosmic harmony. I understood in that moment why the enemy had worked so tirelessly to corrupt worship on earth, to reduce it to empty ritual or emotional manipulation, because if humanity ever recovered the technology that David had mastered, the science of using sound and intention, and surrendered hearts to literally open portals between dimensions, we would become the liberation force that the entire groaning creation had been waiting for, and the materialist philosophy that had convinced billions that existence was merely mechanical and meaningless would collapse like the lie it had always been. The download reached a crescendo that I thought would shatter me, every cell of my body vibrating at frequencies that matter was never meant to sustain, and yet I did not come apart, but instead came together in a way I had never experienced, as though I had spent my entire life as scattered fragments, pretending to be a unified person, and only now was actually integrating into the wholeness that had always been my intended design. The Psalms were not merely entering my mind, but rewriting my foundational code, and I realized that this was what the ancient texts meant by being transformed by the renewing of your mind. Not moral improvement, but actual structural renovation at the level where consciousness interfaces with the quantum field that generates physical reality. And I understood with terrible clarity that I would never again be able to live as though existence were random or meaningless or merely material, because I had experienced directly the truth that every atom was a word, spoken by the Creator, and still resonating with the intention that had called it into being. The messenger's voice surrounded me like a symphony as it said, "What you are receiving is not new information, but ancient remembrance, not foreign knowledge, but the recovery of your original design, because every human being was created to be a conduit, between heaven and earth, a priest-king after the order of Melchizedek, just as David was and Jesus is, and the great deception was convincing you that this capacity was reserved for special individuals rather than the birthright of every soul willing to surrender to their true identity. I felt the hand beginning to withdraw from my chest, and I wanted to cry out for it to stay, to keep filling me with this impossible knowing. But even as the physical sensation of the messenger's touch faded, I realized that what had been given could not be taken back, that I was forever marked by this transmission. And the stone in my other hand pulsed with warmth, as though confirming that I now carried within me a frequency that would continue to unfold and teach me for the rest of my days. The messenger stood before me once more in the chamber of eternal light, and I saw that the ghostly witnesses who had appeared earlier were now more solid, more present, their faces shining with expressions of welcome, as though I had just joined a family I had been separated from since before my birth. And the being's voice carried a note of something that sounded almost like joy as it spoke its final words for this encounter. You have been given the frequency. You have remembered the technology. You have felt the Psalms as living keys rather than dead history, and now you understand that worship is not what you do for God, but what God does through you when you align yourself with the creative intention that holds galaxies in their courses and knows every sparrow that falls and has numbered every hair on your head, not as surveillance, but as intimate participation in the existence of every particle of his creation. I understood that I was being prepared to return, that this eternal moment in the palace beyond time was concluding its current phase. But I was not the same person who had been brought here, and the world I was returning to would not look the same to eyes that had seen reality unveiled. And the messenger confirmed this by saying, "When you wake in the desert with the sun rising over Jerusalem, you will carry within you a truth that cannot be argued or debated, because it is not theory, but experience, not belief, but knowing. And there will be others also awakening to this frequency, other bloodlines remembering their purpose. And together you will become a chorus that sings the ancient song in a new key, and the palace will begin to manifest again, not in one location, but wherever 2 or 3 gather in true worship, because you are the living stones that the builder is assembling into a temple not made with human hands. And the glory that once filled Solomon's structure was only a shadow of what is preparing to fill you. The light released me, and I fell backward through layers of reality that peeled away like veils, each one a different frequency of existence, and I gasped as the cold desert air struck my lungs, and my body remembered its weight and limitation, collapsing onto sand that felt almost offensively solid after the fluid dimensions I had just inhabited. My eyes opened to the soft gold of dawn spreading across the Jerusalem desert, painting the ancient hills in shades of amber and rose, and for a moment I could see both worlds simultaneously, the physical landscape of rock and dust, and the shimmering dimensional palace that occupied the same space, translucent and magnificent, slowly fading from my perception, but not from my knowing. The stone was still clutched in my right hand, and it was warm, pulsing with a gentle rhythm that matched my heartbeat. And when I held it up to the rising sun, it seemed to glow from within, the carved symbols now making perfect sense to me as a map, a key, a declaration written in a language that predated human alphabets, but spoke directly to the soul that needed no translation. I sat up slowly, my body trembling not from cold, but from the aftershock of containing frequencies that flesh was never designed to hold. And yet I was not damaged, but clarified, as though I had been a cloudy lens that someone had finally cleaned. And now everything I looked at carried a depth and meaning that had always been there, but which I had been too blind to perceive. I understood with crystalline certainty that my life until this moment had been a preparation, that every loss and victory, every question and doubt, every moment of worship in churches that sometimes felt empty, and every prayer whispered in desperation had been building toward this encounter, this remembering, this commissioning into a purpose that was both terrifyingly large and intimately personal. The messenger's final words echoed in my mind like a song I would never stop hearing. The truth that I was a living stone being built into a temple not made with human hands, and I looked down at my own, shaking hands, and saw them differently now, not as mere flesh and bone, but as instruments designed to carry frequency, to touch the material world while channeling the spiritual realm, to be a bridge between heaven and earth, just as David had been, just as Jesus perfectly was and is. I thought about returning to my ordinary life, to the people who knew me, to the routines and responsibilities, and I realized that nothing would look the same because I was not the same, that I had been fundamentally rewired at a level deeper than psychology or belief, that I now carried an experiential knowledge that could not be argued away or forgotten, no matter how strange it seemed, in the light of common day. The sun climbed higher, and the desert began to warm, and I knew I needed to move, to return to the city, to begin the impossible task of integrating what I had experienced into a life that still required me to eat and work and exist among people who had not been taken to the palace beyond time. And yet I felt no anxiety about this, but rather a profound peace, because the download was still unpacking itself inside me, and I sensed that I would be taught how to walk this out, one step at a time. I stood on unsteady legs and looked toward Jerusalem, the ancient city golden in the morning light, and I saw it now as David had seen it, as Jesus had wept over it, not merely as a collection of buildings and history, but as a focal point of cosmic significance, a place where the membrane between dimensions had always been thinner, where heaven had touched earth repeatedly throughout the ages and would do so again. I understood that I was being sent back not to convince or debate, but to simply live as a tuning fork, to carry the frequency I had received and allow it to resonate with others who were also waking up to their true design, because the messenger had been clear that I was not alone in this, that bloodlines across the earth were stirring with ancient memory, that the palace was preparing to manifest again, not in stone, but in people, in surrendered hearts that would become the dwelling place of the presence that no building could ever contain. I felt the weight of this calling, but also the sufficiency of the grace that came with it, and I remembered how the light had flooded me with the Psalms, how worship was revealed not as religious duty, but as the fundamental technology of reality, the frequency that aligned all things with their created purpose. And I knew that my life from this moment forward would be an exploration of that technology, a daily practice of becoming what I had been shown I already was, in the depths of God's intention. The stone grew warmer in my palm, and I heard without hearing, sensed without physical sound, a whisper that might have been the messenger, or might have been the voice of the Holy Spirit, who the messenger had said was the ongoing presence of the transmission I had received, saying simply, "Go now, carry what you have been given, let your life be the evidence, and trust that everything you need will be provided as you need it, because you are not working for God, but with God, not serving a distant king, but partnering with the presence that dwells within you and recognizes itself in every sincere seeker you encounter." I took my first step toward the city and felt steadier than I had expected. The stone now tucked safely in my pocket, but its warmth radiating through my clothes and into my skin, a constant reminder that what had happened was not dream or delusion, but the most real thing I had ever experienced, more solid than the ground beneath my feet, more true than any fact I had been taught in schools that knew how to measure matter, but had forgotten how to recognize spirit. I knew that challenges would come, that speaking about this encounter would invite skepticism and misunderstanding, that the materialist worldview that dominated my culture would have no category for what I now carried. And yet I felt no need to defend or prove anything because the transformation was not in my arguments, but in my presence, in the frequency that now played through me like a song in a key that resonant souls would recognize even if their minds did not yet have language for what they were sensing. As I walked, I began to quietly sing one of the Psalms, the words now alive in my mouth in a way they had never been, and I felt the air around me respond, felt the dimensional palace shimmer back into visibility for just a moment, a confirmation that I was not leaving it behind, but learning to carry it with me, to be a mobile tabernacle, a walking testimony that the sacred and the ordinary were never separate, and that God had never been distant, but was closer than breath, waiting only for hearts willing to remember their design. The sun rose higher, and Jerusalem drew nearer, and I walked forward into my transformed life, carrying an ancient stone and an eternal truth, a witness to the reality that we are all so much more than we have been taught to believe, that we are the ones the prophets spoke of, the generation that would see the glory return, not to buildings made with hands, but to the living temples we were always meant to become. What truth has been hiding in plain sight, waiting for you to remember. Subscribe to continue this journey beyond the veil.